So welcome everybody to this joint talk between the Manchester Classical Association and the Manchester Centre for Public History and Heritage here at Manchester Metropolitan University. And what a huge honour this evening to be joined by Professor Jackie Murray from University of Kentucky, where she's a professor, associate professor of classics and Black studies in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, Literatures and Cultures. She's an expert in Hellenistic poetry and prose, especially Apollonius and Callimachus, and in research around race studies and the reception of classics in African American and African Caribbean literature. She teaches some amazing sounding courses at Kentucky, one on Hellenistic prose, especially with a focus on Jewish writers, and one on Black classicisms, the works and life of Anne Julia Cooper and her sisters in the aftermath of the US Civil War and their teachings around classics. She has various publications, a wealth of publications, particularly around Callimachus and Hellenistic prose and poetry, but also around race and sexuality in the Odyssey, and various projects going on, book projects, including around racecraft in Greek and Roman epic. But you haven't logged in to hear me talk, you've logged in to hear Professor Murray talk, so I'm going to hand over to her and she's got some slides, so thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you all for inviting me to this amazing event. The daylight savings time messed up things, but not so much because now my students can actually attend the class. So I'm going to show my slides. All right, so the talk is going to be Racing Greek Epic, Ancient and Modern Racecrafts in Tension. And I'm going to begin with, slides don't move when I want them to. Okay, so I'm going to begin with the question of, did you know that Homer's Odysseus was Black? Did you? My students know, but but yeah, in the Odyssey, so in general, when we see film representations, of course, of the Odyssey, we tend to have the characters are white and Mediterranean looking for the most part, but sometimes you get the bizarre scenario of a blonde, blue-eyed Odysseus, which doesn't really work. As Sean Bean here, I'm not really feeling it. And mainly because in the Odyssey, Odysseus has Black skin. So the word Black for black skin, melancroes or melancrous, is mentioned twice in the Odyssey, and both in relation to Odysseus. In book 16, it is Odysseus when he's being transformed by Athena. Is she transforming him back to his original appearance? She reveals his black skin. His skin turned black, and the cut of his jawline was firm, and his dark beard clustered around his chin. This is Odyssey, in the Odyssey. Okay, so we could be talking about, a dark-skinned Italian or Greek or Mediterranean figure, no problem. And however, the second time it's used is with when Odysseus is now in disguise. So I guess he's pasty-faced and old again and not looking his beautiful best. And he's sitting in front of Penelope and he's testing her to see, she's testing him to see if he actually is who he claims he is, which he's not, he's lying. But he's claimed that he's met Odysseus before they went off to Troy, right? And so she wants to test it to see, okay, are you who you say you are? What was he wearing when you last saw him? And so then he gives a description of what Odysseus was wearing. And then he also gives a description of what Odysseus looks like. And he says that he looks like his Kerux Eurybates, right? Who is black skin, curly haired, only he's a little bit your body's a little bit shorter, right? And he says that, and Odysseus prized him most of all, his men, because their minds were worked like one. And we know that this sort of like-mindedness is a feature of the Odyssey. It's Odysseus prizes that when he meets Nausicaa. He tells her he wishes that she would find a husband who is like-minded, and presumably he and Penelope are also like-minded, right? So there's ways of the way in which he describes Eurybates is supposed to remind Penelope of himself, right? Because he doesn't look like himself. So he's trying to, and he's basically checking to see if she has a kind of emotional memory of him. But nevertheless, it's precisely these kinds of passages in Greek where everybody loses their minds, I think, because they don't want to translate, or don't know how to translate these words like melanchroous here, because of the long legacy of white supremacist appropriations of classics, going back to the early, pretty much the foundation of the discipline. We have a problem of making classics serve a white supremacist agenda. And so when it comes to translating the idea that a hero could have Black skin is problematic, because it says something, it goes against the prevailing modern ideology about race and Blackness. And this brings me to Du Bois. So in Du Bois, in the Negro, which is one of his many, many, many books, this is an early text. We published this in 1906. So after his famous book, The Souls of Black Folk, he then published this one. And here he's interested in the ancient history of Black people. Where do Black people fit into the ancient world, right? Because the sort of dogma that is being produced in universities and you know, in the educated milieu in which he operates is telling us that there's no Black civilization in the ancient world. Blacks were always supposed to be the slave class. Even back in antiquity, they're a stunted people. They're, you know, at the bottom of the evolutionary chain, and that's where they're supposed to stay. And there's no civilization that Black people could ever produce. So this is what Du Bois is trying to unravel, right? And he's not the first, and by far, of Black intellectuals trying to find Black people in antiquity, right? And so what he points out here is that it's interesting that in the US at the time he's writing, right, there is what makes you Black is the one drop rule. Basically, a Negro may be 7/8 white, right, since the term refers to a person of Negro descent. So this is what we call hypo descent. Basically, if you have one drop of Black blood, you're Black, despite what you look like. So you could be blonde, blue-eyed, etc., what people think is white, but you have ancestors who are Black, and legally in America, you are Black, right? And so he's pointing this out, that, okay, so we operate under a racial, it's an ascriptive racial system that tells people that they're Black, even if they don't necessarily look Black. And this is the reason. However, when we go back to ancient history, right, we can't find any Black people in Africa. This is the point, especially when we come up against huge civilizations. So if or what counts as civilization for the time, like and certainly the idea is empire, right? So evidence of empire, such as monuments and pyramids, etc. If we find this in Africa, well, it couldn't have been by the Black people. It must be by somebody else. And so he points out that it's really amazing that this is how we define Blackness in America, yet it's very in sharp contrast to the way the term Black or Negro is used in Africa. When you're talking about Africa, all of a sudden we can't find any of the all the dark people in Africa are not Black or not Negroes anymore. The real Negroes dwell in the space between the Niger and Senegal. So this is the whole development of the idea of sub-Saharan Africa, right? So North Africans aren't African enough to be considered Black. And so, but he points out then, he goes on to point out in that particular passage that what's really the problem is the unwillingness to find Black people in the ancient world that aren't slaves, that aren't quote unquote savages, right? That don't have evidence of empire. Now, so he points out then that, and he has this famous statement about what really makes a person Black, or what actually defines their race, right? It's not really anything to do with what they look like, because again, if you could be blonde, blue-eyed, and still be Black legally, which you could be up until 1978, where there was a legal case where a woman who looked white was trying to be reassigned legally to being white, but she had ancestors who were Black, and she actually lost the case. So we're dealing with this. On the one hand, there is this idea that it has to do with physical appearance, yet at the same time, it has not to do with physical appearance. It's really about power, right? And so he says, the Black man is the person who must ride Jim Crow in Georgia. That is the Black person. Whoever the dominant culture says is Black is Black. That's how it works. And indeed, you had problems for immigrants, especially Southern European immigrants, Italians and Greeks, coming into America were not considered white, right? And so often there were instances of racial aggression against, say, Italians, especially where Italians could be lynched or were lynched because they were assumed to be Black in America. All right. So, well, what is race then? So I wanted to just give a couple of definitions, and it's this category, it's an adscriptive category in terms of like people are posing it on others. It's different from, say, ethnicity, where people might actually choose to claim an ethnicity, whereas race is something that is imposed upon you by illegal formal constructions, and but it's there to naturalize hierarchical power, right? Usually economic hierarchical power. It's one of the ways in which the powerful maintain their position in a hierarchical structure. And so they're the ones then that determine in one of the articles I talk about how race is something that is tendentiously constructed from the perspective of the dominant group, right? In that they're the ones that determine who is white, who is Black, who is close to them, which ethnicities are okay, which ethnicities are not, and the society that they control dominates or sort of manages the relations. So there's punishments for those ethnic groups who are alienable, whose humanity can be alienated from them by the dominant group through laws or actual aggression, etc. And so people who are not considered, who don't fit perfectly into the dominant group category can be moved along this continuum I have here, depending on how much assimilation is taking place versus not taking place. But then there always needs to be a racial group, the group that everybody's afraid of ending up in, right? And so the in this hierarchy, there's the dominated, alienated people who are constantly being subjected to demonstrations, spectacular demonstrations of their lack of humanity, right? By the way the dominant group operates, right? And so, but the point of that is, of course, to maintain the system, because then folks who are potentially alienable or who are alienable are afraid of being alienated, and so they toe the line, as it were. Now, this thing won't move automatically, apparently. Okay, so one way of thinking about it then is that you've got this motive coming from the top to exploit the hierarchy and maintain a hierarchy where the folks at the top benefit from labor, from favors, etc., right? But you have to naturalize it because people have a sense of fairness. I think an intuitive sense of fairness, and if they're not being treated fairly, they feel upset. So you got to get people from feeling that oppression and therefore becoming aggressive and fighting back. So what tends to happen is ways of naturalizing storytelling that maintain the system. So you have the more aggressive versions, which are violence, the police, mobs, terrorism, KKK, this kind of stuff. You have institutional mechanisms that maintain race through laws, education, religion, etc. But then you also get the soft power mechanisms, which is the ones I'm interested in. So the storytelling, film, monuments, etc. They don't have any actual physical, they don't create any actual physical violence, but they are supporting a system by the way in which the soft power mechanism is actually where the individual resentments come from, right? Like, so you can't have racism without racists, right? Well, you could, but I don't think you need people who are actually going to pull the lever, maybe not consciously, but they're going to pull the lever to make it that way. But you also do need the actual hatred and hostility. In at least some of the people in the system need to be made to believe that the racialized group is subhuman, and how you get them to believe that is through one of the ways in which is through storytelling and these soft power mechanisms. All right, and so you can think about, in terms of getting back to this issue of Black skin, and how Black skin is then created as one of the identifying markers of the subordinated race, is by taking, constantly repeating stereotypes of Black skin as being dirty, Black skin as being a monstrous aspect, right? And so it goes all the way back to this interpretation of the Aesop's fable about the washing the Ethiopian. It's a misinterpretation that implies that, oh, you need to clean the Ethiopian, and then this gets repeated very in art, high art, as well as soap ads all the way down. And so the constant barraging of the mind of the population with these images, and notice this is, like, it's all over Europe. We've got in America plus in France, and so it's not just something that's specific to the US. This constant barraging of the population with the idea that Black skin is bad or is connected to moral or racial inferiority. This is a way of keeping the mind of people sort of locked into that way of thinking. And then, of course, you develop films and telling these same stories over and over and over, explaining how the way things are. So back to Du Bois, he points out that you can't ignore the extraordinary fact that a world campaign beginning with the slave trade and ending with the refusal to capitalize the word Negro, leading through a passionate defense of slavery by attributing every bestiality to Blacks, and finally culminating in the evident modern profit that lies in degrading Blacks. All this has unconsciously trained millions of honest modern men into the belief that Black folks are subhuman, a mass of despicable men, inhuman, at best laughable, at worst meet for mobs and fury. And this is the point, yeah, that this, the unsuspecting person is constantly being fed this imagery, and your minds are being shaped by the ideology behind it. And so let's get to the way in which classics then is used in the reception of this, right? So one of the earliest films, came out a little bit earlier than Birth of a Nation, is Cabiria. Cabiria is a film about a girl that gets abducted and carried away in North Africa. She's in Carthage. So one thing to start off with is Carthage is in Africa, yet all the people that are of any kind of significant status are white. All the slaves are black. So we're in Africa, but all the people are white except the slaves. Again, reinforcing the idea that blacks are slaves. Even in antiquity, blacks are slaves. Even in Africa, blacks are slaves. So that's the first part, right? But what's interesting is that, okay, in the early 1900s, black actors were not, of course, part of the Hollywood setup, and so the black actors will be played by white actors in blackface. And so this is precisely what happens. The main sort of hero, the main hero is the figure Makiste, right? And Makiste is played by an Italian who is then, put on black paint or makeup to be black, right? But he's actually the hero of the story, and he's very moral, etc. So then they have problems with this because it goes against the idea that, wait a second, the black person is the good guy. Like initially, what's interesting is initially people thought, oh, Makiste can be the hero of Italy, like the Italian hero, but then there was a pushback because of the attempt to become white by Italians, especially Northern Italians, were claiming, no, he can't be because he's black, right? Anyway, so one of the ways in which they mitigated this problem was having the actor go to the theater. And remember, back in the day, they would have the theater. They'd also have like a stage, and then people play music. It was still it was a much more lavish entertainment system back then. And they would have the actor show up at the theater, and he would show up either white already and point out that he is in blackface, or with blackface and wipe it off. The point being to show that he is really white, and that's why the character can be good, right? So that's one issue. So then, so this is Jacqueline Reich in her metamorphosis of Makiste, an Italian silent film. She says that, well, the initial Makiste film accomplished this transformation in 4 distinct ways. It changed, it changed the race from African to Italian, right? So this is the new Makiste. So the original film is Cabiria, and then it was so popular, they wanted, of course, to do spin-offs, right? And so the spin-off then is going to be Makiste. He's going to be the guy. And so how they then deal with this is, as she says, they change his race from African to Italian. They make him Italian, and they set the films in modern Italy, and they change his skin color from black to white, and then through the self-conscious referencing of the blackface tradition, and it shifted the film's tone to appeal to the wider film-going whiter and whiter film-going audience. And so here you got these scenes in Makiste where Makiste is, of course, he's disguised as a black dandy slave, right? But he's then later, the next scene you see him washing off his black disguise, right, to reinforce the idea that he's not really black. So that's how they transition him from, in the spin-off, to the modern version. And then from there on, Makiste is a white Hercules figure. In fact, he becomes like the ancestor, like it's filmographical ancestor of the Hercules films, right? Which played by Steve Reeves. and other actors, but primarily Steve Reeves dominates that whole genre. And what's interesting here is this is the one from, I think it's Hercules, the original Hercules one, which is actually a Jason the Argonaut story. That's why I was interested in it. And this guy is Odysseus again. So Odysseus is again represented as well. I have no problem with Odysseus represented as a Mediterranean, Italian, Greek, no problem. But yeah, so here he is, represented as, Italian there with dark hair. And so that could be fine. But there are no Black characters in this film, except in this one particularly is the Jason and the Argonauts one I was mentioning, or Hercules and the Argonauts. It's really what it ends up being. The Colchians are presented as these sort of troglodyte, quote unquote, freaky people that are all Black, right? When they actually fight them off to get the fleece, there's this racializing narrative going on there. The bad people are the Black people, and they're monstrified. All right, and then but recently though, we've been having this sort of shift where we're allowing at least people of color to play heroic roles, and so I would say Dwayne Johnson here as Hercules is one of the earliest moves in that direction. Didn't receive much backlash because everybody can imagine Dwayne Johnson as Hercules, and he, even though he is a person of color, not too much backlash on that. Maybe he's just not dark enough to cause backlash, but he doesn't get any. But in general, though, when we think of the representations in film of the hero, the Greek hero or the Roman hero, it's always a white person, right? So we have Russell Crowe and Colin Firth and of course Brad Pitt as Achilles, no problem. And you are all in England, so you're probably well aware of the backlash to Troy Fall of a City, which had, that was my first slide, which had David Gaiazzi, so this one, David Gaiazzi as Achilles, right? Now, I would say both Brad Pitt and Gaiazzi are too far out of what ancient Greeks would have thought as identifying with themselves phenotypically, right? Both of them are on the opposite scales of how they would see themselves in terms of phenotype and skin color. But it's interesting that it's Brad Pitt's Achilles that doesn't get any backlash, yet Gaiazzi's does, right? And that has, again, a lot to do with the constant use of classics, a reception of classics in this sort of white supremacist discourse. And we can think about 300 as well, right? Where, again, we're not necessarily, or I guess we are kind of necessarily monstrifying Black, though there is the Black character is associated with the Persians. He's the ambassador of the Persian king. But notice, nobody could have missed how Xerxes was represented as this monstrous, gigantic, and then of course it's anti-trans representation too. He's presented as the monstrified trans person in a gigantic state. So there's a lot of monstrification going on, attacking a lot of marginalized identities in this. And also what's also going on is, of course, at this point, certainly the ramping up of a racialization of Middle Eastern Arab peoples, Muslim peoples are being racialized. So this sort of dressing up of the Persian warriors in ways that sort of evoke Muslim extremist warriors is not an accident. I think it's part of that whole idea. But then we can also go back again to the earlier representations, like Ray Harryhausen's Clash of the Titans, the original, where again you have the monsterified Caliban or Calibos, who's of course an evocation of Caliban in Shakespeare, who's a Black figure there, and he's monsterified he's the monster in the Clash of the Titans, and also even the way in which Medusa is represented as well. Medusa is also given dark skin, and she's, and in her myth, of course, she was beautiful, and then she was made ugly and given snaky hair by Aphrodite, and so one of the ways in which she's made ugly is by making her have dark skin. So this constant representation there. And then we can think about the Cleopatra, which is going back to the earliest film versions of that, where you notice that there she is, this white queen. This is also the time where there was the whole white goddess idea as well, like going into Africa and you're finding, that everybody's worshiping this white goddess, white woman. So yeah, so here you have, I think it's Claudette Colbert as Cleopatra, but notice all her slaves are Black. Now, it's not necessary in antiquity that slaves all had to be one racial phenotype or ethnic identity. In fact, it was actually counseled against. They didn't want to have their slaves to be of the same origin, right? Mainly because that would give them something in common that they could then join together and find solidarity and overthrow or fight back, right? And so it's actually ahistorical, of course, but it's not serving a historical agenda. It's serving an ideological agenda, reinforcing the idea that, okay, yeah, you want to be back in Egypt. Well, Egypt had a white queen. This is another reason to focus on Ptolemaic Egypt is, of course, you can make the argument better that, the pharaoh and the queens were white because it's a new dynasty, the Greek dynasty or the Macedonian dynasty. But again, did they consider themselves white? No. Or the idea of whiteness didn't even exist. So, and moreover, they did think of themselves as a different race. And this is what I want to get into. They thought themselves as a god, which is a different race from mortals. So in that way, there was a racial hierarchy. One of the racial hierarchies has to do with who is divine and who is not. So we can move forward into the Cleopatra, with Cleopatra, and you get, of course, repeating the same image again with Liz Taylor's version. Again, it's much more elaborate, but nonetheless, same idea. She's being carried in, and her super Black slaves in this case are lifting her and carrying her and Caesarion forward. And there they are behind her, bowing. And so, but what's interesting, again, Cleopatra is a site in the film industry where you fight over ethnicity about antiquity. So you have all of these actresses that have played Cleopatra, all of them varying versions of white. But lately, though, of course, the fight has been over where people of color are being brought in again. So you've got, because of course, African Americans in particular claim Cleopatra, and some Africans as well claim Egypt and claim Egypt being in Africa. They claim it, and so yeah, so you have proponents of different actresses to play the next Cleopatra. I think right now it's Gal Gadot is winning out, but you had Rihanna and other actresses there. So anyway, so we can see then that the films in the representation of the classical world tends to serve whatever the racial agenda is in our day, and our day, it has to do with Black skin, white skin, phenotypically driven, right? But that's not really how race was working in antiquity, and that's what the second part of this I want to close with, talking about how it was described. And I want to focus again on the Odyssey because I've written about it. But if we go back to looking at what Du Bois is talking about, what race is, right? And remember that you could be Black in America at the time he's talking about and still be blonde and blue-eyed, right? So the phenotypic stuff is just another, it's just a layer. What's really going on is this mystical monsterification of a particular group of people, and then applying dehumanizing double standards upon them, as in order to show that they are not, their humanity has been alienated. They are not worthy or whatever of being treated as equal. And so we think about in the Odyssey, then the figure of the monsterified figure is the Cyclops, right? The Cyclops is the figure of uncivilized. They are these brutes, according to Odysseus. Odysseus is telling us this, of course. They don't have any setup of civilization as far as he can say, sir. No meeting place, no council, no laws. They live in the mountains and in caves. And this is, of course, connected to shepherding, herding your sheep. And the Cyclops is, of course, a shepherd. And they don't interact with their neighbors. But some of this stuff is not even true, right? Because we do find out that the neighbors do care. They come to find out what's going on. And Odysseus has made it that the Cyclops is going to send them away inadvertently. And also the way the story is presented to us is also from the hero's perspective, because it is about Odysseus. And we are not really worried too much about what are they doing in his cave, violating the laws of Xenia, right? That's sort of like, we're not supposed to worry too much about it, because we're being put in the position of the Phaeacians, who actually have a history of hating the Cyclopses, because they forced them out of their homeland to their new homeland because they were so violent. So he's telling it to an audience that has a grudge against the Cyclops. So they're going to forgive him for all of his violations of what is actually morally okay. But his goal, though, in his Cyclops story, is to show how his Kleos is tied up with him humiliating the Cyclops, right? His victory over the Cyclops involves him humiliating the Cyclops, right? He blinds him, and of course, being blinded in the ancient world was, opened you up to all kinds of discrimination and bad treatment, so that's the, his Kleos is connected to ability to humiliate. And in general, the heroes, what makes you a hero is your ability to protect your people, your family, from the humiliation that will come from your city being sacked, your women being enslaved, your sons being killed, thrown off the ramparts, etc. So this is what makes you a hero. This is what Hector is. Hector is a hero because he can, or he's at least attempting to defend his homeland. And when he dies, the women point out that their whole life now is destroyed because they will become slaves, etc. So humiliating your enemy is actually one aspect of it, of being a hero, being able to do that. And then, of course, the Cyclops curses him, as we know, and which shows that the gods actually don't, Homer's gods don't actually buy into everything that the heroes are up to, right? They may have some semblance of what is right. And so the Cyclops curse only partially comes true. But what I wanted to get to was that the Cyclops then becomes like the metaphorical monsterified version of the actual people who are actually racialized in the Odyssey. So the folks that are actually racialized they're racialized by these actual practices that work all the time in racialization. in addition, again, these are in addition to the violence and legal stuff, and the other aspect, this is just how society functions to reinforce subordination of the group and keeping them in that place. But it's one thing to be put into this subordinate class, but behind it is also the monsterification. So the fact that monsterification is part of it. That's what makes the difference between, say, race and class. Class, I think that they're basically the same idea, is to keep everybody, below and serving the in a hierarchical system, the people at the top. But within that, you want to divide the people in the lower hierarchies and establish a group that is an outgroup, a monsterified outgroup. And so in the Odyssey, you have shepherds. So you have the monsterified shepherd being the Cyclops, and then you actually have shepherds. And some of them are deemed good from Odysseus's perspective, and then some of them are bad from Odysseus's perspective. But when you focus on them, you find out that there are these double standards that operate upon them in terms of like what kind of things that they can have. So in terms of, we keep hearing about how they only get particular kinds of food. They don't have as good food as the suitors or Odysseus would have. They don't have the same kind of clothes. Eumaeus points out he only has the one outfit that he has, one cloak that he has, and he got that when he was a kid. So Odysseus asking for it is a little bit of a problem, right? And when Odysseus, when he finally realizes, Eumaeus realizes that Odysseus seems to be a down and out hero and not whatever he is, right? There are similarities, but then there's the fact that his stories are of him being a down and out hero. Eumaeus says, okay, well, why don't you ask Telemachus for clothing, because you can wear that. Like basically he'll give you nice clothing because you, as the down and out hero, can actually wear that. He would not be able to wear that. Eumaeus would not be able to wear that. There's also like the kinship restrictions come out in this, where Eumaeus talks about his friendship with Odysseus's sister, and there's something going on there. There's a bit of erotic language there to suggest that maybe he might have had desires for her, but she ends up getting married. She ends up getting married to somebody else, a hero. He gets sent off to the field to be a shepherd, which is what he was bought for, right? And so, yeah, so there's other I'm getting most of these from the Field Sisters book on Racecrafts. I strongly recommend you read that. But a lot of these things are involving like the whole universe centering the dominant group. So even when there's oppression in the Odyssey, when Eumaeus is talking about the oppression that he's experiencing as a shepherd from the suitors, he quickly turns it around to, but poor Odysseus is feeling worse, which, okay. And also, but really interesting is the ritual deference that occurs as well, where all the heroes, and I put the suitors in the hero category, and so they demand, half of the reason why everybody has to do what they say is because they are heroes, and the slave girls and the shepherds can't resist that. They have to obey them, even if they are not Odysseus. They still have to obey them because they're in that dominant class, and so there is this demand for deference that sometimes even defies rationality, where they have to do that. So you have this sense that there are groups in the ancient world, and particularly enslaved populations in the ancient world. So the slave girls, women that are enslaved, and especially there, because the way in which war tends to produce slaves is through killing the men, killing the male children and enslaving the marriageable aged women and girls, right? And so they're the ones that get taken in war, and they are a slave class, and they produce more slaves, right? And so race is created through war and through slavery, and the epics sort of justify this in the way they talk about it, the way they present it. They, or at least they do problematize it to a certain extent, but it is presented sort of as the way of the world. And so we can think about that. We're comparing it to modern representations of race, and we can see that in the ancient world, they did have racialized groups, though they were not based on physical appearance. That comes in later, mainly because during the Enlightenment, you have the issue of, well, all humans are equal. Slavery is actually on the wane in Europe, but at the same time, they've discovered America, they've discovered the New World, and the need for slaves to make profit is extreme. And so you've got people trying to jostle or deal with, okay, well, on the one hand, all people are created equal, but on the other hand, we need slaves. Well, what if there are people who are actually not people? What if there is a natural slave that Aristotle talks about? Oh, look, Africans are natural slaves. And then this is the narrative that we've been fed since then to justify the slavery. But in the ancient world, the idea of having, as I said before, the idea of having slaves that were of the same ethnic identity or even appearance was explicitly said to be a bad idea, mainly because of the fact that, they could combine together and have slave revolts. And there were many slave revolts in Antigua. Not many of them were successful, but there were. And so you're advised in a lot of ancient manuals about slavery, not to have too many slaves from the same region or from the same group, because they can find commonality. So this is jettisoned in the Renaissance. This idea is jettisoned, and because they're going to be bringing slaves from all the same continent, mainly because they wanted to distinguish between who's human and who's not, right? And how they're going to define who's human and who's not is to do with the skin color. So anyway, so I wanted to stop there and take some questions, because I've got a lot more to say, so I just figured I'd just stop here.